The show is strictly for educational purposes. The opinions expressed on the show are personal to the individuals appearing in the show and not those of Thinking Tree Ecoholics Private Limited. The show is not intended to offend or defame any individual, entity, caste, community, race, or religion, or to denigrate any institution, person, living or dead. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Hello and welcome to the Thinking Tree series powered by Ecoholics. Our guest for today is Mr. Dan Mitchell. Dr. Dan Mitchell is the chairman of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, a pro market policy organization he founded in 2000. His major research interests include tax reform, international tax competition, the economic burden of government spending, and other fiscal policy issues. Having also worked at the Cato Institute, he has decades of experience authoring papers, writing editorials, working with the public policy community, and presenting the free market viewpoint to newspaper, television, and radio media. He has spoken to a wide variety of groups in dozens of cities and more than 50 foreign countries. He has also served on the editorial board of the Cayman Financial Review and holds a PhD in economics from the George Mason University. Welcome to the show, sir.
Well, thank you.
How are you feeling?
I'm doing fine. I hope you're doing well.
Yes, sir. Things in India are pretty iffy right now, but we sure are hoping to be in a better position now. So, my first question to you is, can you draw us a big picture and tell us about the major global economic issues that have arisen or worsened due to COVID?
The number one problem that countries have is that the virus caused varying degrees of economic shutdowns. Sometimes because governments order the shutdowns, sometimes because people just instinctively were much more cautious. But there's been a big decline in overall economic activity, less work, less saving, less investment, less entrepreneurship. And these are the things that generate the prosperity for people. And so when there's less of these good things happening, economies begin to shrink. And it's especially harmful for lower income people who don't have a lot of savings to rely upon.
Okay, so that's a huge problem that we're facing right now because of the shutdown. Of course, there's a huge economic loss that every country has faced so far, but let's hope the situation gets better now that the economies are recovering. So my next question for you is, in the words of Mr. Robert Azevedo, director WTO, world trade is expected to fall by between 13% and 32% in 2020 as the COVID-19 pandemic disrupts normal economic activity and life around the world. These numbers are ugly. There is no getting around that. But a rapid, vigorous rebound is possible. So this is what he said. How long do you think will it take for an economic recovery, especially in the developing countries?
I think an economic recovery will be quick. The bigger challenge is, will it be strong? Some economists talk about the best case scenario being a V-shaped recovery. In other words, the economy went down quickly, but then hopefully it rebounds quickly. I don't think that will necessarily happen. I think some consumers and some businesses will simply be cautious. Some sectors of the economy will be especially adversely affected. Major sporting events, the cruise ship industry, anything where you have lots of people coming together in close quarters. I think there's going to be a major challenge. Movie theaters. How many people are going to want to go to a movie theater when maybe someone will cough, 3 seats away from them? So there will be, I think, some major challenges. And I also think that governments are maybe not being very sensible about some of their steps. So if they're giving people money to be unemployed, that's, I guess you could say, that's compassionate. But what if that winds up giving people an incentive not to go back to work? Or what if, as a result of the fiscal erosion, there's less tax revenue now, and governments have been spending a lot of money. What if politicians say, well, we need to impose a bunch of tax increases as a result? That might make a recovery less likely. And then, of course, you mentioned that we've had a big collapse in world trade. I'm actually somewhat hopeful that trade will rebound relatively quickly because, after all, you buy a product made in another country, presumably there's not going to be any coronavirus on it. However, we also have the related challenge of protectionist impulses among a lot of politicians around the world. You have the specific challenge of anti-China sentiment, and that might lead to different trade barriers. And so there's a lot of moving pieces in here. Suffice to say, it would be great to get a very quick, strong economic recovery, that V-shaped recovery that people talk about. But I worry that governments around the world are going to make that difficult.
Can you specify the case of developing countries? I mean, a V-shaped recovery, of course, it's possible in a country like US, but when we talk about India or other third world countries, how do you think the recovery is going to look like?
I'm actually maybe more optimistic about developing countries than I am about say OECD countries, Western
Mhm.
countries. In the United States, we have politicians spending trillions of dollars giving people money to not work. Well, presumably those types of policies are not very affordable in developing countries and lower income countries, and so as the immediate threat of coronavirus begins to subside, there will be a very big incentive to get back to work, to try to make money, and hopefully that will lead to a quicker economic rebound. But then again, we don't know how much world trade will be affected, and of course, if rich countries aren't importing from less developed countries, that's going to have a negative effect. We don't know what types of government policies, especially the higher tax burdens that we might see in some of these nations. So I really think you almost have to look on a country by country basis to see what types of government policies are being enacted and the degree to which those policies will make it more difficult for people to engage in productive behavior, work, saving, investment, entrepreneurship.
So not having an employment trap is actually working in our favor right now. That's great. So now we've talked about the negative points of this pandemic. Let's consider one of the positive points. Like, what opportunities have been brought in by this pandemic that are still untapped by the people around the world?
That's a hard question to answer. I guess the simple thing that we've observed, at least in the United States, because obviously I'm not going to be nearly as familiar with what's happening in other countries, but at least in the United States, businesses that operate more online have seen a relative benefit for the simple reason that nobody shut them down. Some big businesses were allowed to stay open, companies like Walmart. Well, you can buy almost anything that you buy at Walmart at a small business, but politicians shut down the small businesses, and so Walmart got another what we call big box stores got a relative benefit in a way that I think was actually unfair. But will that be a long-lasting change? Will the small business sector recover? That's an area I'm worried about because a lot of small businesses don't have the financial reserves of a big company, a big publicly traded company. So we'll have to see how that develops over time in the United States.
Okay, so these are the measures that government can take to tackle COVID. What are the measures that general public can take to uplift the economy besides following the social distancing norm, of course?
There's probably not a good answer to that question either, because yes, of course, people will do social distancing and be more cautious, but that by itself does not uplift an economy. If anything, it maybe slows it down. So everybody, whether you're a business or whether you're a household, and this is really one of the key insights of economics, everyone does a cost benefit analysis. Am I going to shop the way I used to shop? What are the risks of potentially catching coronavirus? If I'm running a business, are there ways that I can sort of reformat my business that in ways that make consumers feel more comfortable? That's why I don't think we'll have a V-shaped recovery. I just think there's going to be a process of adaptation in the economy as businesses and consumers try to figure out new ways of dealing with the situation. And of course, one of the reasons it's hard to answer your question is because we don't really know whether the coronavirus is going away. We don't know whether there's going to be secondary surges, and there's conflicting evidence on that. Some people are saying, oh, especially with the protests we have in the United States, are there going to be more infections in those states or in those cities where the protests are taking place? We've had some state governments reopening their economies. Will there be secondary surges of infections? Some nations are already seeing the coronavirus basically disappear. Places like New Zealand and Taiwan have had very successful experiences, but other countries right now are seeing increases in infections. And again, the question is, in a lot of big countries, will there be those secondary outbreaks? So we have to admit that we have uncertainty here. We have to admit that we don't necessarily know the right answers because this is something we can't control, at least not very well.
But with the rising awareness, people are understanding that the small businesses are the worst affected. And people are trying to buy from these local groceries or small businesses to promote them to help them sustain during this pandemic. Don't you think that is going to help a little in the recovery, a faster economic recovery?
People feel a great deal of empathy and sympathy for their local small businesses. And some of them do, as you pointed out, they're making a special effort to try to patronize those local small businesses. So that'll help. There's no question about it. But if you've had this much economic damage because of coronavirus and because the big box retailers were allowed to stay open when you were forced closed, well, what if you only have this much benefit from local consumers trying to patronize you? So you're still probably going to be worse off in the long run, and especially in the short run because of the coronavirus. And as I said before, if you don't have a lot of financial reserves, if you don't have a cushion, some savings to rely upon, it could very well be that many small businesses will just cease to exist, and that's very sad.
So there's no going around the fact that there's been huge economic losses because of COVID, and it's going to take a good amount of time to come back to the normal circumstances that were there before COVID began. So yeah, it's I think though, but we can sure help in a faster recovery. Your point is valid. So my next question is, what approach do you feel has been more effective in fighting the virus? The nationwide compulsory lockdown, like in India, or the health advisory to follow social distancing norms by the US?
There wasn't one single policy in the United States because we have 50 state governments that were in charge of these things. So some states did impose lockdowns. Others simply said, be cautious and be careful, follow social distancing and things like that. So it was many different approaches. And of course, if you look around the world, you had countries like Sweden that basically had a less restrictive approach. It allowed businesses to stay open. It allowed, in many cases, schools to stay open. Now, Sweden did have higher infection rates than some countries, but they had lower infection rates than other countries. And likewise, when you look at states in the United States, you find that almost all the deaths were in places like New York and New Jersey, Illinois, and a few other states. Many states were only lightly affected. And then if you dig deeper into the data, you find that, at least again, looking just at the United States, that a very disproportionately large share of the fatalities were in nursing homes. So, what can we learn from all this? Well, we should be cautious about the conclusions that we're drawing because additional evidence, I'm sure, will come out. But maybe the best approach would have been not to order lockdowns, but to take special steps to protect vulnerable old people in nursing homes. Maybe there should have been special policies about international travel. Is there a way of trying to isolate and target infected people so that they can't spread the disease? Some countries have done an okay job at that. Some countries have not done a very good job. So hopefully 1 year from now, governments will have learned important lessons so that if another pandemic occurs, we can deal with it more effectively. But right now, my instinct as an economist is not to have top down centralized policies by government, but instead to allow some diversity and to rely on the common sense of people, give the economy a little bit more flexibility to continue functioning. But maybe 6 months from now or 1 year from now, we'll have additional evidence that will point different directions about how to deal with this kind of crisis.
Okay. So, of course, it's going to take time for economies to recover, and there's no one approach to fighting COVID. Um, and of course, just locking down or a health advisory is not enough, but it has to be backed by enough testing and medical facilities, and that is there. So we hope to get back on on track very soon. So what pattern, according to you, must be followed by the world governments to quicken the process of economic repair? As in, what are the target industries that must be brought into action before the others? What sequence must be followed in providing stimulus to various areas of the economy?
There are many different ways to answer that question. The one of the first things, at least in the United States, that we should do is to get government out of the way. We have two bureaucracies, the Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control. And it turns out those bureaucracies, because of all the red tape and regulations they impose upon medical labs and the pharmaceutical industry, they've made it very difficult for the private sector to do testing, to develop tests, to deploy tests, to manufacture personal protective equipment. So it turns out that we learned a very painful lesson in the United States that too much regulation, too much red tape makes it very difficult for the economy to quickly react in ways that could have reduced fatalities, could have reduced infections. Now, that's a sort of a micro economic answer to your question. You, of course, were also asking about the macroeconomic issues. But even when we're talking about macroeconomic issues, how to get the overall economy functioning better and growing faster, creating jobs and wealth for people, even there, I think the answer is mostly the same: get the government out of the way. If you wind up giving big benefits to people for being unemployed, yes, you can argue that's compassionate, but you also need to consider the fact when you're doing these cost benefit analyses, you need to consider the fact that you might be subsidizing them to be unemployed rather than going out and working and creating more wealth. And when you add additional fiscal pressures of big so called stimulus packages, you then increase the risk that politicians will impose tax increases. And those tax increases generally are very poorly designed, so they do a lot of economic damage per the amount of money being collected. We don't want high tax rates discouraging work, saving, investment, and entrepreneurship. So we're dealing with a what some people might call a black swan event, something unexpected that shocked the economy and caused a lot of economic losses, sometimes exacerbated by government. But I think we would have suffered big losses regardless, simply because of the need for consumers and businesses to be cautious. So if we want to try to recover as quickly as possible, I think it's important to get government out of the way. But let me add one other point that I think is important here, and it applies to many of the questions that you've asked me. Because there's a lot we don't know, it's good to have different approaches. We're going to learn more because of decentralization. There's not one world policy. We don't want everyone to follow the WHO, the advice from the World Health Organization. They've been wrong some of the time. And so when they don't really know what's going on, and if they were to recommend just one policy for the entire world, and if the different governments around the world follow that, what if it's the wrong approach? By having many different countries, or for that matter, many different regional governments within countries following different strategies, we're going to learn we're going to have different experiences that give us data indicating what's the best approach. So I'm in favor of what's the phrase, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Try many different approaches. Allow the private economy and individuals the freedom and the flexibility to react in ways that reflects their cost benefit analysis. I think that's the right way forward. We don't want to put, we have a phrase in the United States, I don't know if you have it in India, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
In other words, you want to have some diversification because you can learn more from that experience.
So, to summarize your answer, you are saying that we should let the markets organically come back to their feet without having too much of legislation from the governments. To summarize your answer, if I put that right?
Yes, I think that by and large, I'm a believer in markets rather than statism. I think top-down central planning and socialism and things like that, you never find countries that have become prosperous with those kinds of policies. So my bias is always to have more economic liberty because I think people are better positioned to improve their lives than you get with politicians who oftentimes are just corrupt and are looking out for themselves. So yes, my bias is toward free markets and limited government. Now, of course, we've already talked about a virus, a pandemic being a black swan event. And so, were there reasons for governments to perhaps be intervening to some degree? I guess so, but I always want to be cautious about that because, of course, once you give governments powers, a lot of times politicians don't want to give up that power and then they'll misuse it in the future.
Okay, so looking at the historical perspective of the situation that we are right now in the middle of, so what are the macroeconomic fundamentals that we have in place right now and that we did not have during the Great Depression of 1929? And will those macroeconomic fundamentals help in reducing the damage?
I'm not sure that I would phrase the question that way because if you look at the economic history of the United States, it turns out that one of the big problems in the Great Depression was that government was doing things, but they were doing bad things. The Federal Reserve, which our central bank in the United States, which was created in 1913, well, the Federal Reserve followed this very erratic and misguided zigzag monetary policy that first pumped too much money into the economy and then withdrew money much too quickly. And that causes all sorts of problems with misallocation in capital markets. We also had big increases in tax rates under both Hoover and Roosevelt, the two presidents during that period. We had the terrible protectionist legislation during the Hoover administration and under the Roosevelt administration. Some of this started under Hoover, but we had lots of government intervention, economy mired in a deep downturn. So I think government actually bears a lot of the blame for causing the Great Depression, and then government bears a lot of the blame for keeping the economy stuck in a Great Depression. So it's not so much whether or not the macroeconomic fundamentals were good back then versus bad today, or bad back then or good today. I think the fundamental lesson to be learned is that we need to be very cautious about whether or not governments and politicians are intervening in the economy, because so often, if we simply look at the empirical evidence, the intervention winds up causing more damage than any potential benefits that we see from that intervention.
Okay, sir. So, what, according to you, is like the absolute need of the hour right now?
I think the biggest need that countries have is to get economies back up and functioning. What is economic growth? What is prosperity? Well, it doesn't matter what your underlying economic philosophy is, whether you're a socialist or whether you understand markets. There are still two factors of production, labor and capital. And if you want more prosperity in a country, you somehow have to make sure that labor and capital are getting mixed together and deployed so that there's additional economic production. as I've already said, I think markets do a much better job of allocating labor and capital in ways that generate more broadly shared mass prosperity. Again, I don't think we've ever seen a country at any point in the world that became rich with lots of central planning, price controls, government intervention, high tax rates, and things like that. But whatever one thinks, whatever your view is on economic policy, we need to get labor and capital back to work again. We've had this shock to the economy because of coronavirus, which means that we now have labor and capital sitting on the sidelines, getting those factors of production, getting entrepreneurship back in play so that businesses are creating jobs and giving people opportunity. I think that's our critical need today. Now, I have my bias, which I've openly admitted that I think markets work better than governments in doing this. But again, set that aside. Somehow we need these factors of production. We need entrepreneurs. We need people to be back out there feeling more confident, maybe not fully confident because of the uncertainty about additional outbreaks of the infection, but we need people feeling that the government's not standing in their way so that they can more quickly bring labor and capital back into the economy in ways that are helping us restore growth and hopefully building prosperity, especially for the less fortunate people in our societies.
You've built a very good picture in front of us, sir, about the macroeconomic problems and everything that's going around in the world, and what can we do and what can the governments do to help quicken the process of recovery. So, do you have any final words of encouragement for ecoholics?
Well, I appreciate what you folks are doing in terms of trying to make economic knowledge and economic analysis more accessible to people in your country. I think it's vitally important that we improve education. What is education? It's a form of human capital. So just as it's important to have good technology and machines and factories and equipment, it's also important to have people with the brain power and knowledge and understanding of how economies work. And when you're an economist, what are some of the most important principles? Understanding cost benefit analysis, uh, understanding the importance of incentives. So if government is too big with taxes being too high, there won't be as many incentives to work, save, and invest. So anything that improves economic understanding is vitally important for the future of a country. So I'm very glad that you and your group are doing things to help expand economic knowledge.
Thank you so much, sir, for coming to our show today. I know you must be very busy, but you agreed to grace our show, and you had some very beautiful insights about the condition that we are in right now. And those insights, if put to great use, can actually help in a great economic recovery pretty soon, as you said about the V curve. So, thank you so much for your insights, sir, and it was just great having you with us today.
Well, it was great to be on the show, and it was good to meet you, even if only over the computer.
Thank you, sir.